go. Good, sorry. Om Sahana Vavatu Sahana Bhunaktu Saha Vidyan Karavavahai Tejasvinavadhitamastu ma vidvishavahai. Om Shanti 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 Chaitanyam Sarvagam Sarvam Sarvabhuta Guhashayam Yat Sarva Vishayatitam Tasmai Sarva Vide Namaha. Very good. Welcome back. We continue. Oh, yes. Thank you. Welcome back. My apologies to our online viewers. I keep forgetting to put up the prayer slide at the beginning of the class. Anyway, we begin today a new chapter. Can we see the title slide, please? Chapter 5. We continue to have these very short chapters, and the contents of this chapter, I think, are wonderful. So far, this is my favorite chapter we've seen in this text. Buddhi aparadha prakarana. Prakarana here means chapter. The chapter talking about the aparadha of our buddhi. Aparadha often means sin, but not in this context. We're not talking about a sinful buddhi, but a buddhi that makes mistakes. And that's the second meaning of aparadha, is an error, a mistake. Our buddhis make mistakes that have consequences. I mean, if your buddhi makes a mistake and you break a law, you can get in trouble and suffer the consequences of that mistake. But there are far worse mistakes, and the worst mistakes have to do with your failure to recognize your true nature as sat-chit-ananda, Atma. In particular, the mistake, actually a good way to begin, the mistake, by the way, aparadha here means mistake, and the mistake we're going to be discussing in this chapter is a mistake that we've discussed already called adhyasa, superimposition. And we can understand this adhyasa, superimposition, in several ways. Here's a twofold way to understand superimposition. We can superimpose something good on something that's not so good, or reverse. We can reverse something not so good on something that's good. The first one is called shobhana adhyasa. And this is a commonly, in fact, let me put it on the board. It's an important term. I think it's helpful if you know it. Let me push the right buttons. Okay, so aparadha means mistake, and we're going to talk about a twofold mistake, two kinds of mistake. One is called shobhana adhyasa, and the other one is simply the reverse. You can just put the word in front. Shobhana means literally that which is beautiful. Adhyasa, as you know, means superimposition. So we superimpose something that is beautiful. I think desirable would be a more meaningful translation here. We superimpose desirability on something. And my favorite example, some of you will remember this from other classes, my favorite example is ice cream. Because commonly we think ice cream is a source of happiness. You eat ice cream and you enjoy it, and if you don't think about it, you'll attribute the source of ice cream, you'll attribute the source of happiness to the ice cream. But as you know very well, the true source of happiness comes from within. You also know that happiness is not an ingredient in the ice cream. If you look at the box, you won't find happiness among those ingredients. So this is a good example of shobhana adhyasa. We superimpose the happiness we feel when we eat the ice cream. We think it's actually coming from the ice cream. So that's our classical example of shobhana adhyasa. And in the first verse, we're going to see the opposite case. And the opposite case, ashobhana adhyasa, is when you superimpose undesirability on something desirable. And in this case, what's desirable is this wisdom of Advaita Vedanta. You might get some of this from your friends. Your friends say, why are you studying all this Shankaracharya, all of this stuff? Why are you studying this? What do you get out of it? So your friends have superimposed undesirability on these teachings. You find them valuable. Your friends may not find them so valuable. They think it's, probably they would use the word, it's so boring. And if we don't approach these texts properly, they can be boring. So I don't blame your friends for having that opinion. Anyway, let us begin with the first verse and see the reverse example. Where am I? We're going to see not shobhana adhyasa, but the reverse of shobhana adhyasa. Okay. Mutra shanko yato danko, mutra shanko yanko, nagrahidamritam munihi, nagrahidamritam munihi, karmana shabhaya jantor, karmana shabhaya jantor, atma-jnana grahastata, atma-jnana grahastata. Start at the bottom. Atma-jnana agrahaha. The failure to grasp Advaita Vedanta, atma-jnana here, self-knowledge, the failure to not grasp, take, or accept. The failure to accept atma-jnana is due to, third line, karma nasha bhayat jantoho. Jantoho, for people, there is karma nasha bhaya. Bhaya, fear of karma nasha, fear of the loss of karma. Now, if you've attended our prior classes, remember our long discussions about the importance of rituals in Shankaracharya's time. Not an issue for us. Huge issue in his time. And the argument went like this: if you study Vedanta, you stop doing these rituals, and if you stop doing these rituals, you're finished. That was the world view in Shankaracharya's time. May not be our worldview. So this is the karma nasha bhaya, that these teachings would lead to the loss of your required rituals. You drop those required rituals. To understand it in a more contemporary context, many people have had this concern. In fact, I had this concern. I remember talking to my guru about it. And the concern is this: if these teachings lead you to a state of such perfect contentment and peace, doesn't that lead to a state of passivity in life? Why will you try to do anything? Why will you exert effort? Why would you get engaged in any activity? And that's a common argument against these teachings of Advaita Vedanta. We've discussed this in other contexts. I just want to give you the answer very briefly, because that's really not our topic here. But the issue is that these teachings destroy kartritva, the sense of agency. I did it. But as we've discussed in prior chapters, in the absence of that feeling, I did it, you still act. An enlightened person eats when he or she is hungry, sleeps when he or she is tired. So it's not that enlightenment renders you like a what expression would they use? Like a potato. The potato doesn't do it. They call it couch potato, right? That which does nothing is a potato. It's absolutely inert or passive. But we see and we know enlightened people who are not couch potatoes, who are absolutely engaged in activity, but they engage in activity without that sense, I did it, I do this. Okay, so you've understood this from prior studies, but here, that's not known. In Shankara's time, it wasn't well understood, and in modern times, it may also not be well understood, that these teachings do in fact destroy the sense of agency, I did it, but they don't render you passive, inactive, inert, like a potato. And which means that these people with this mistake, they are superimposing non-desirability on atma-vichara. This is why I introduced that idea of shobhana, adhyasa, superimposition of desirability. And here's the reverse case. Atma-vichara frees you from suffering. What could be better than that? But there are people ready to superimpose undesirability on the solution to the problem of human suffering. What a huge mistake. And that mistake is illustrated with this brilliant example that comes from the Puranas. Also in the Mahabharata, if you studied Mahabharata thoroughly, at the very end you find a story about the rishi Uttanka. And actually there's Sri Krishna actually gives this rishi Uttanka, gives him Vishwarupa Darshana. Anyway, this is a story at the very end of the Mahabharata. Here, that rishi is called Udanka, same one, Udanka or Uttanka. They're the same rishi. And here, this rishi, I need to tell you the story to understand this verse. So this rishi apparently prayed to Lord Vishnu. And, oh Vishnu, please bless me, and bless me in particular with amrita, the nectar of immortality. And this rishi was apparently devoted enough that Lord Vishnu decided to bless him. And Lord Vishnu then requested Indra, king of the gods. This is a wonderful story. He requested Indra, king of the gods, to give this amrita to the rishi Udanka. And Indra, however, wanted the amrita for himself and the other devas. He didn't want to share it with this rishi Udanka. And on the other hand, Indra couldn't ignore Lord Vishnu's command. So he had to be obedient to Lord Vishnu's command. So Indra assumed the form of a chandala, an outcast. And in the form of this chandala, this outcast, he came to the rishi Udanka with a vessel of amrita. And so he was fulfilling Lord Vishnu's command. Now, this rishi Udanka was one of those really traditional rishis, and for him, this shuddhi, in the south you call it muddy, is really important to him. And so being in association with this so-called outcast was horrifying to him. I'm not justifying that. I'm just saying this is what the story is. So this rishi Udanka was horrified by the appearance of this Chandala, and the Chandala said, here's your Amrita. But Udanka said, I'm not going to get, was thinking, I'm not going to get Amrita from a Chandala. He thought that the pot contained not Amrita, but urine. and refused it. And that is the story that Shankara refers to in just half a verse, where he says, the muni, yatha, you have to break, the words are all scattered apart. Top line, middle. Yatha, just like Udankaha, who was the down a line, munihi, the muni, the sage, the rishi. So just like the rishi Udanka, he was mutra ashankaha. He had the doubt that that it was, mutra is urine. So he had this doubt that it was urine and not amrita, and therefore na agrahit amritam. He refused to accept the amrita, thinking it was urine. This is the example of the opposite of Shobhana Adhyasa, to superimpose undesirability on something that's so desirable. Look at the contrast. Amrita is the nectar of immortality, and he refused that nectar of immortality due to this mistake. And that's, you can see why the title of this chapter, Aparadha, this kind of mistake, and in context, as the last half of this verse shows, and that is people doubt the value of these teachings. It's all boring philosophy. It's a waste of time. They are superimposing undesirability on what is ultimately the solution to human suffering. So it's a huge mistake, a huge error. And we're going to see, moving ahead, other kinds of error. That's what this whole chapter is about, just 5 verses. Buddhistash chalati vatma, Buddhistash chalati vatma, dhyayati vacha drishyate, dhyayati vacha drishyate, naugatasya yatha vrikshas, naugatasya yatha vrikshas, tadvat samsara vibhramaha, tadvat samsara vibhramaha. So here we see another mistake born of superimposition. Here the superimposition is to superimpose the activities of your mind on the consciousness that reveals them. Right now, whatever is happening in your mind is revealed by consciousness, the consciousness which is your true nature, but there's, because of the proximity, we've had this discussion a lot, because of the proximity of consciousness and mind, there's a lot of superimposition that goes on. And the most common example of this is when sadness is present in your mind. The sadness belongs to your mind. The sadness is revealed by your consciousness. Your consciousness remains utterly unaffected by the sadness it reveals, just like the sun remains utterly unaffected by anything it shines upon. Yet, we conclude, in the presence of sadness, when sadness is present in my mind, I become sad. I feel sad. Where that I refers to your true self, atma. So this is the error of identification, to superimpose the qualities and activities of your mind, get superimposed on atma, which is unchanging consciousness. And just let's make sure we understand that principle before we see this verse. In order to accurately perceive the changing conditions of your mind, your consciousness necessarily has to be an unchanging observer. This is the reasoning. We've used this in other contexts. Your mind goes on changing. If your consciousness changed right along with your mind, you wouldn't recognize the changing conditions of your mind. Specifically, if atma became sad when sadness entered your mind, would you know that sadness entered your mind if you simultaneously became sad? You may remember my story about you're driving your car at 60 miles an hour and the fellow in the next car is drinking coffee at 60 miles an hour, but you don't perceive him drinking coffee at 60 miles an hour because you're traveling at the same speed. In order to see him drink coffee at 60 miles an hour, you have to be an unmoving observer on the side of the road. This is a metaphor, so we understand then that your consciousness, by the way, when we call it divine, what does that suggest? Something not worldly, something transcendent, and obviously something that doesn't get affected or changed by what happens in the world. Therefore, your consciousness is the unchanging observer that reveals, that knows all the changing conditions of your mind. There's more to be said, but we'll come to that shortly. But here comes the confusion. Buddhistaha atma. I connect the first and last words. Atma, your true self, consciousness, which is buddhistaha, abiding in the mind, established in the mind. Consciousness and mind. This is the reality. There is no dividing line. In one sense, there is a dividing line between observer and observed. Absolutely, there's a dividing line. But how far apart are they? Right? You're the observer of me. You're sitting many feet away from me. What is the distance between consciousness, observer, and mind, thoughts, sadness, observed? There's no distance at all. That's an important factor. So that's what it says, buddhistaha, consciousness which is present in the mind. That consciousness, chalati eva, seems to move. Dhyayati eva, seems to be still. Dhyayati can also mean meditate, but here it means to be still. So drishyate, it is seen that consciousness, when it abides in the mind, seems to sometimes get active, seems to sometimes remain quiet. Of course, it's your buddhi that is sometimes active. It is like right now, your buddhi is very active. In deep sleep, your buddhi is inactive. So the activity and inactivity belong to the buddhi, mind, and not to consciousness, but experientially, that may not be how it feels. And this is one of my favorite topics, and we've talked about this before, how experience fools us again and again and again. And Shankara gives a traditional and brilliant metaphor that describes exactly how experience fools us. He talks about now gatasya, somebody who is going in a boat. Now is boat. So now gatasya, for a boatman, someone going in a boat, yatha, it's just like vrikshaha, trees. When the boatman is going down a river, on both sides of the river there are shores and trees going, standing up. Do trees move? Not much. They grow a little bit, but trees are stationary. But if you can imagine yourself in that boat going downstream, the trees, from your perspective, are moving backwards, right? Imagine yourself in a boat, looking at the shore. You're going downstream, but your Einstein would like this. He talked about these his perspectives. So from the perspective of the boat, the trees are moving, right? Trees don't move. This is an erroneous interpretation of your experience. If you conclude the trees are moving, you've made a mistake. Of course, it's unlikely that the boatman will make that mistake, but it's possible, right? A child, an infant in that boat would certainly make that mistake. Oh, look, the trees are moving. The boatman knows better. So in this metaphor, and this is a very common metaphor, but a very good one here, he says, he concludes, tadvat samsara vibhramaha. Such, in the same way, is the confusion of life, samsara. So we make the same confusion of life if the stationary trees represent unchanging consciousness. The boat moves, representing your buddhi, active mind. The boatman, if we want to add to this metaphor, represents ahankara, your ego. We're going to come to that in the very last verse here. So there is an ahankara, the ego, who is the master of the boat of the mind, right? The boatman is a master of the boat. Ahankara is the master of your mind. Remember, ahankara is a thought masquerading as a conscious being. Ahankara is that feeling of I-ness, that feeling of being an individual person, the one who has a name, your name. Your name is applied to that ahankara. So the boatman is the ahankara, the boat that travels down the stream represents your mind. The trees don't move. If you wrongly assume the trees are moving, you've made a wrong interpretation of a common experience. Interesting, the boatman won't make a mistake, but people commonly make this mistake about consciousness. The mind goes on moving, and they assume, I change. And it's such a false assumption. The consciousness which is present in your experience right now, and the consciousness which was present in your experience when you were an infant, did that consciousness grow and age, or is that consciousness identical? The same consciousness that revealed the activities of your mind when you were an infant is the same consciousness that reveals the activities of your mind today. It is truly unchanging. But we make this error. This error is described further in the next verse. Naustasya pratilomyena, naustasya pratilomyena naganam gamanam yatha naganam gamanam yatha atmana samsritis tadvata atmana samsritis satvata dhyayati vetihi shrutihi dhyayati vetihi shrutihi. So we're back to naustasya. Prior verse, naugatasya, one who goes in a boat. Here, naustasya, one who stands in a boat. Talking about the same boatman. So for the boatman, there is second line gamanam, movement, naganam, of the trees. By the way, for our Sanskrit students, na-ga doesn't move. It's a word for tree. Naga, that which doesn't move, means tree. So naganam, for trees. The gamanam, the motion of trees. Now stasya, for the boatman, the motion of trees is pratilomyena, in the reverse direction. So the boatman is going downstream. The trees, from the boatman's perspective, when the boatman looks across to the shore, what does the boatman see? The trees are going backwards, pratilomyena. And this is the metaphor in the last line, atmanaha samsritihi tadvat. And tadvat, in exactly the same way, is samsritihi, the experience of worldly life, atmanaha, for the true self. So this is the metaphor is explained here one more time, and that is the erroneous interpretation of a common experience. So if the boatman thinks the trees are moving backwards, he's made an erroneous interpretation of the experience. If you think the activities of your mind affect you, you've made an erroneous interpretation of your experience. And he gives some evidence from the scripture. He says the scriptures say the same thing. Dhyayati eva iti shutihi. Shutihi, the scripture here in particular, it's a famous passage in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, where it's talking about atma dhyayati eva lelayati eva. Atma seems to meditate. Atma seems to be engaged in action. The stress is on the word eva. It seems so. And this is where the reference to our misinterpretation of experience. Now, notice there's something subtle going on here. So, dhyayati eva, he gives reference to scripture, Brihadaranyaka. Prior verse was talking about the experience of the boatman. So, remember we've had this discussion about shruti, yukti, and anubhava, the three foundations on which these teachings are based. So here, in the last line, we have shruti. Before that, we have anubhava, right, talking about our experience. And in the next verse, we have yukti. So Shankara very skillfully is employing all three. Let's see this. Chaitanya pratibimbena, Chaitanya pratibimbena, vyapto bodho hi jayate, vyapto bodho hi jayate, buddhe shabdadi nirbhasas, buddhe shabdadi nirbhasas, te namo muhyate jagata, te namo muhyate jagata. Start in the third line. Buddhehe, for the buddhi, mind, intellect. So for the mind, or in the mind, what occurs is shabda adi nirbhasas. Nirbhasaha means appearance. The appearance, perception is actually a good translation here. There is the appearance or perception of shabda, sound, etc. So right now, you hear my voice, so appearance of sound. You see me, so with your 5 senses, you learn about the world around you. All of this is nirbhasaha. It arises in your mind. Buddhehe. All of this arises in your mind. And in the second line, all of this is called by Shankara here, bodha, knowledge. Now, this is in Vedanta, it's actually not uncommon, but it can confuse you at first. Knowledge, we usually understand knowledge as that which is true. But the term knowledge is also means that which is known. So that which is true is knowledge, and that's the most common meaning of knowledge in Vedanta. But that which is known is also knowledge. So right now, the sound of my voice is known to you. The sound of my voice is known to you in your mind. So therefore, it is bodha, a kind of knowledge that occurs in your mind. The very Vedantic use of the word knowledge, and you'll get used to it in time. So anyway, knowledge here doesn't mean knowledge of what's true. Knowledge here means, in this case, knowledge of the world around you, right? Your knowledge of what I'm saying, your knowledge of my appearance here, your knowledge of the world around you. So bodha means knowledge, but knowledge not as what's true, knowledge as your perception of the world around you. And this jayate arises, buddhehe, in your mind. So perceptions like sound and sight, etc., they arise in your mind. All thoughts, everything, every cognition. We break mental activities into these 3 categories, as you've heard from me many times before. Mental activities are categorized as either cognitions, thoughts, emotions, feelings, and sensations or perceptions, what you get from your 5 senses. All 3 categories of mental events, we call them vrittis, you've heard that word before. All these vrittis, jayate, they arise, buddhehe, they arise in the mind. And now the key of this. These vrittis that arise in your mind are vyaptaha, pervaded, chaitanya pratibimbena, by the reflection of consciousness. Now, what we're about to discuss is a very profound analysis of the relationship between mind and consciousness that I think is unique to Advaita Vedanta. I don't think you'll find this anywhere else. Let me introduce it properly. This will floor you if you think about it. What is a thought? What is a vritti? What is it made of? It's hard to answer that question, right? This is in spite of the fact that it is so common. We experience thoughts, we experience cognitions, emotions, and sensations all the time. But I'm asking you, what are they? What are they made of? And here in Advaita Vedanta, we get a brilliant and clear explanation. This is an explanation I've not seen in modern science. I've not seen in other philosophical schools. I think it's unique to the teachings of Advaita Vedanta. What they say, and they use they meaning traditional teachers of Advaita Vedanta go back to this metaphor of the clay pot. The pot has nama rupa, name and form. The pot has content, clay. And this then becomes a metaphor for vritti, for any thought, emotion, or perception. The content of this pot is clay. The content of your thoughts, emotions, and perceptions, the content is consciousness. Whatever happens in your mind is made of consciousness, like this pot is made of clay. The form of this pot gives rise to what you experience. You don't say, I experience clay. You say, I experience a pot. So the experience of pot is due to nama rupa, but the content of pot is clay. In the same way, your experience of thoughts, a thought is a nama and rupa. Emotions, nama rupa, name and form. Perceptions, obviously, nama rupa. The nama rupa associated with all of your mental activities are like the pot that gives form to the clay, but just as the content of the pot is clay, the content of your mental activities is consciousness. Does that work for you? This is so crucial to understand this particular teaching. The consciousness that is present in your thoughts has a special name. In fact, it's so important. Let me go to the board. The consciousness that is present in your thoughts. Now, there's consciousness that pervades the universe. That's not what we're talking about. Just like there's clay everywhere, here we're talking about clay in a pot. So now we're talking about not all pervasive consciousness, but the consciousness that is present in your mind, the content of your thoughts. That consciousness is called ch5. Chid is the word chit, consciousness. When chit is followed by this it becomes da, and the word is chit. Chit-abhasa, chid-abhasa, abhasa, appearance or manifestation. Chit-abhasa is the appearance or manifestation of chit, consciousness, but specifically the manifestation or appearance of consciousness in your mind, in your thoughts, in your emotions, and in your perceptions. That is chid-abhasa. Often it's called reflected consciousness. We say that your mind has the capacity to reflect or manifest consciousness, like a mirror has the capacity to reflect light. So your mind having that special quality, just as a mirror has a special quality of being able to reflect light, your mind, due to sattva guna, has a special quality of being able to reflect, figuratively speaking, consciousness, to make consciousness manifest. So that reflected consciousness, the consciousness manifest in your mind, is the content of all your thoughts, emotions, and perceptions. Just as the pot is a combination of nama rupa and content, clay, in the same way, all your thoughts, emotions, and perceptions, like the pot, they all have nama rupa, and that's what gives them their distinctive nature. So sadness is nama rupa. The content of sadness is consciousness. Is that making sense now? Sadness is nama rupa. The content of your experience of sadness is consciousness. Happiness is nama-rupa. The content of that happy experience is consciousness. The sound of my voice appearing in your mind, the sound and my words, nama-rupa. The content of your experience of my voice in your mind is consciousness. Okay, we're on board. This is a sophisticated concept. And like I said, I believe it's unique to Advaita Vedanta. I find it brilliant. And a brilliant explanation of our experience. I've not seen this anywhere else. So that's what Shankara says in the first 3 lines of this verse. He says that in your mind there arise varieties of mental events. We call them vrittis. Each of those vrittis are a particular name and form determined by your mind, and the content of all those vrittis, of all your mental activities, the content is consciousness. And that consciousness is atma. There's no difference between consciousness and atma. But tena, with regard to this condition of thoughts arising in your mind, having the content of consciousness, about that, jagat, the world, meaning people, momukhyate, are continually confused. We continually misinterpret the experience of our own thoughts. Look at this. What we've just discussed, when we say the content of your thoughts, the content of, let's make it plain, the content of experience. What is experience? Experience must include consciousness. Is there such a thing as an unconscious experience? Doesn't make any sense. So experience requires 2 factors. One is obviously consciousness, and the other is whatever you're experiencing. Right now you're experiencing me, nama-rupa. Your experience right now of me sitting here is nama-rupa plus consciousness, both of which occur in your buddhi, in your mind. This is just brilliant. But momukhyate jagat, it's not properly understood. And understanding this is the key to using these teachings of Vedanta to radically change the way you relate to your mind. We often feel victimized by our minds. Sadness, anger, frustration occurs in your mind, and it sure seems to affect you. This is the key. Tell me, how is clay affected by this pot? And if I were to break this pot, how is clay affected? What are we saying here? How does your mental activities affect consciousness? Do you see the metaphor? Consciousness is the content of everything you experience. Whatever you experience is nama-rupa at a different level of reality. So just as potness is less real than clay, right? Our definition of real is that which persists. Pots come and go, the clay persists. Mental activities come and go, consciousness persists. So with regard to the pot is less real than the clay. That which is less real can't affect what is more real. Just like the dream mugger can't hurt you. Because the dream mugger is not as real as you are. Only that which is as real as your physical body can injure your physical body. That which is less real can't injure your physical body, the dream mugger. So, the pot form, nama-rupa, is less real than clay, can't affect the clay. Your thoughts, the form of your thoughts is less real than consciousness, can't affect consciousness. Emotions, the emotion of sadness, the nama-rupa of sadness is less real than consciousness, can't affect consciousness. Everything you see, hear, taste, smell, touch, all nama-rupa, less real than consciousness, can't affect consciousness. The significance of this particular teaching can't be understated, because this is the kind of teaching that can truly free you from suffering, when you can fully appreciate the fact that the problems belong to your mind and not to you. Okay, one more verse which takes us one more step, but it's a pretty big step. Let's see it. It's the last verse of the chapter. Chaitanya bhasatahamas, Chaitanya bhasatahamas, tarartyam chatarasya yata, tarartyam chatarasya yata, iramam shaprahanena, iramam shaprahanena, paraso nubhavo bhavet, paraso nubhavo bhavet. Let me introduce this verse. Let's take this analysis of thoughts, emotions, and perceptions. Let's apply it to ahankara. Ahankara is also a vritti, right? So cognitions, thoughts, are vrittis. Emotions are mental events, vrittis. Sensations, perceptions are mental events, vrittis. And all of these vrittis are name and form plus content. Content is consciousness. Ahankara is also a mental event, which means ahankara is nama-rupa plus content. Content, obviously, same consciousness. The same consciousness because of which your thoughts, emotions, and perceptions exist is the same consciousness because of which your sense of individuality exists. Ego, ahankara, mental event. And just to make sure you remember why it's a mental event, it goes away in deep sleep. It goes away in meditation when you're absorbed. That which comes and goes belongs to your mind, your buddhi. You are the conscious observer. So be very clear what we mean by ahankara, the feeling of being an individual person which is present right now, but goes away in deep sleep and goes away in meditative states of absorption. That's the ego. That's the one who says, I did it. That's the one that gets destroyed by these teachings. That kartritva, that sense of agency. Now, Shankara is going to say something very, very amazing here. We apply the same analysis to the ahankara. So ahankara is nama-rupa plus consciousness. The nama-rupa of ahankara is me, right? Whoever you think you are, your parentage, where you lived, your whole history. Write your autobiography. That autobiography belongs to ahankara. It's the story of Mr. or Ms. Ahankara is your autobiography. So that forms the package, the nama-rupa of your ahankara. Oh, that's nice. The nama rupa of your ahankara is your autobiography. How's that? Your autobiography is the name and form of your ahankara. The content is consciousness. You with me? So think about that. The name and form of your ahankara is autobiography. Content is consciousness. Which is more real? Pot or clay? Which is more real, autobiography or consciousness? Remember, your consciousness existed before you were born. Your consciousness so before the first page of your autobiography, consciousness was. After the last page of your autobiography, consciousness continues. Consciousness is more real. Autobiography is less real. So if you want to know your true self, you have to negate what is less real and hold on to what is more real. We've talked about negation earlier in this text. In this case, for your ahankara, let us negate the autobiography portion of your ahankara and let us retain the consciousness, which is your true nature. And that's what Shankara says in the second half of this verse. Idam amsha prahanena. Prahanena, by removing, by negating. And Shankara uses here a technical term. Idam amsha. The idam is this, the pronoun this, amsha part. The this part. So we make a distinction between an I part, aham amsha, and idam amsha, this part. Every thought has two parts. One part of the thought is consciousness. That would be called the I part of the mental event of the vritti. I'll say that again. Every vritti has two parts. One part is consciousness. That consciousness is your true nature. Let's call it the I part. But your vrittis all have a second part, which is the nama rupa. Let's call it this part. This is Shankara's language, and he uses this language famously in his introduction to the Brahma Sutra, his commentary on Brahma Sutra. So every vritti has an I part, consciousness. Every vritti has a this part, nama rupa. So what Shankara says here is, with regard to not any thought, but with regard to the ahankara, let us do the prahana, the removal of the idam amsha, of the this part. What is the this part of your ego? Autobiography. Let's remove the autobiography, and what remains? Saha, last line, saha paraha. That which remains is the anubhava, pure experience. Bhavet, it is. It is the pure experience. It remains as paraha, which means paramatma. What remains is pure consciousness, limitless consciousness, your true self. Some concluding comments here. This idea of negating your autobiography. Consciousness has no autobiography. Your true nature is not the one who has this lifelong story. This is a radically different way of seeing yourself. It shifts your perspective away from your body, mind, and especially away from your interaction with the world and people in our lives. And it brings you to appreciate your true nature at a very fundamental level. You are the unchanging consciousness which is the content of all experience. This is what Shankara says in his chapter. I think it's really a wonderful chapter. I think of what we've seen so far, I think this is my favorite. Okay, this is a good place to conclude our class. We'll take up the chapter 6 next week, and we'll conclude with our closing prayers. Om sarve bhavantu sukhinah, sarve santu niramayaha, sarve bhadrani pashyantu, ma kaschid dukkha bhag bhavet, asato ma sadgamaya, tamaso ma jyotirgamaya, mrityorma amritangamaya. Om shanti shanti shanti. Om tat sat.